Okay, I think I want to start with a couple of caveats. First, this is a very subjective, not scholarly account. It is basically what I have experienced and what I have observed.
Mm-hmm.
The second, I guess there are going to be three. The second is that there is an assumption that the field of peace education was developed in the West and disseminated to the world, which is totally false. Peace education has been from the time that I was aware of it as a particular effort in education, a global effort with people working toward the same ends all over the world. So naturally, out of that, there are multiple ways to define peace education. So I would just like to put forth what I see as the essence of peace education, and that peace education is teaching for. You don't teach the stance or the issue, but you teach to capacitate the learners for. And among the fours are, and I would say these are pervasive through all the world. Respect for human dignity, for the value of all persons. Appreciation of diversity, to understand diversity as a gift we have to widen and enrich the pool of human capacities. Third would be developing capacities for collaboration. How do we work together to create the conditions to realize those values? Because we understand they're aspirational values, else we would not be having peace education. Peace education is about achieving them. And finally, I think the last thing is, and there's two aspects of this that I want to mention, is the capacity to cooperatively and creatively resolve conflict. And that therein lies a very important shift in thinking that has to take place throughout the world, in most cultures, and that is to start to think of conflict not so much of contentions of interests and purposes and fortunes of the parties involved, but a common problem that both through their interactions have created. So that in order to resolve it, it has to be done cooperatively. And in order to make it a learning experience, it has to be done creatively. We don't just resolve it, we use it to create a new and better situation. So those are all important aspects of peace education. And the substance is very wide, but I think I found those to be common. So I'd like to begin, I'll come back to my own personal experience in the United States at the end. So let me begin in this kind of rapid global overview with Asia, and only two examples of efforts in particular countries. And those countries would be India and Japan. And in each instance, what was being devised as peace education entered into the global field. When practitioners in other countries became aware, they began to incorporate it. Now, the way peace education is practiced and originates is usually out of what the educators see as the main problem. And of course, in Japan, it had been the atomic bomb. So early Japanese peace education was primarily centered, and there's still this strand, even though it has become globalized, of education about the nature and consequences of nuclear weapons. The other country would be India, and the learning that came out of the Indian independence movement, the learning of nonviolence as a philosophy and a strategy. And when that gets incorporated into peace education and peace studies in the United States, unfortunately, it gets separated. And it's like there is the philosophy of nonviolence and there's strategy of nonviolence. So I see that also as the part of the ongoing problematic to enable people to really comprehend that you cannot separate them. They are integral one to the other. The philosophy and values determine the practice and the strategies. And then that becomes important to other issues as well as struggling for justice or resolving conflicts, so forth. All right, so and I knew people doing this, so I have firsthand memories of how that came about. In Africa, I had not too much experience, but some, and I'm going to use three issues, but two different historic periods. The contributions of Africa, particularly South Africa and Namibia, were lifting up the crime of apartheid as a crime against humanity, and one of the major forms of violence that peace education attended to. Because the central problem, I mentioned what the general goals and purposes, the central problematic is violence that stands in the way of those values. So apartheid was a particular form of structural violence which spawned racism and defiled and destroyed any notion of universal human dignity. So that became part of peace education, not only the anti-apartheid struggle, but the nature of the problematic that was another phase of the anti-colonial struggle that was going on in West Africa, wherein the problematic of colonialism as a form of violence and systematic oppression of human rights became a topic that entered into peace education. In Latin America, there were two strands of problems that one ongoing even unto this day, which was the divisions of between people on the basis of their access to resources, societies with a small privileged class, and masses of oppressed people. And my first introduction to that was through people who were actually church-related people, working with people on the ground to raise consciousness, which was a pedagogy being developed by a Brazilian educator that became part of the methodology of peace education. And then my direct experience with Argentine educators who lived under military dictatorship. So the Latin American concern was primarily human rights and the violation of human rights as the main obstacle to peace. peace itself, in the classical sense of accommodation to prevent or overcome war, remained the primary problematic in Western Europe for some time, but gradually all these other interests came in, particularly the dichotomy between what was called the first and the third world, the issues of the economic structures, so that various aspects of war prevention, disarmament, and so forth were part of that. It was a little bit different as we came into the 1970s, and there was an apparent global movement, and UNESCO was recognizing that, and they issued the very well-known 1974 recommendation on education for peace, international understanding, etc. That statement was one of a major landmark because it began an accommodation between educators in the East and the educators in the West of Europe. Eastern Europe was very concerned with economic rights and human rights, and they wanted to advance that. The West wanted to push for disarmament and those kinds of things as the major issue. So, but that they then began to make a comprehensive statement. So that 1974 statement was a very comprehensive statement. Just very quickly, in terms of the United States, we went through all these stages and gradually incorporated the elements of education from all the world, which I ultimately tried to put together in something I called comprehensive peace education. But we did have a very strong beginning, as was the case in Europe, of education for international understanding, on the assumption that if nations understood each other better, they wouldn't make war on each other, which is a somewhat limited assumption. So we went from that to something called global education because it emerged that the separations of nations was becoming dysfunctional, etc. And there has also been a very strong emphasis on United Nations education with model United Nations and so forth, and how to create the structures of peace. And the last thing I want to say is that's where I came in. Because in 1946, when I was in high school, I think I was one of few high school students who was being instructed in this new organization, which we then referred to as the United Nations Organization, the UNO. Now we're very familiar with it, and we just call it by the short name, the UN. And I learned about the UN and what it was about. And one of the high points of my life, which I remember to this day, are two visits as a 16-year-old to the United Nations, once on a field trip, and once because my teacher got up to leave during a basketball game, and I said, "Where are you going?" And she told me she was going to hear a disarmament speech at the UN then meeting just 25 miles from my school. So I said, "Can I come with you?" So I went with her that night, and I heard James Byrne's famous disarmament speech, and I've been hooked on the UN ever since, not uncritically. And that too is part of peace education, to be creatively critical, not just to criticize in the sense of saying, that's not so good, but why don't we think about this? So that's really where we need to be. I think one of the areas we need to be heading is how do we think about the problems in a different way? Again, I'd like to make a preliminary statement because I think it was also implied in your question. To me, peace education, which is that area most interested in cultivating learning for the sake of learning to do the things that make for peace, is one area of a broader field of what I call peace knowledge. All that we learn about possible ways to achieve peace. Some of it is in classical research. Some of it is in university scholarly studies. Some of it is in education, which is in elementary and secondary schools and the non-formal sector with the emphasis on learning. And some of it is in the peace action that we do on the basis of how we see the problems and what I was speaking about before, potential alternatives. So when I think of the mothers of the field, they come from all of these areas. And I am finding it a little hard now to think in chronological order. So I will just speak about them and try to put them, as I speak about them, in their historic context. I'd like to, again, I'm going to start with Japan. And my very, very dear friend, Hisako Uchida. Hisako was a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Hisako was very well educated, but like most women, she did not have a professional career. But she worked every day of her life on substantive peace issues. She was extremely well informed, and she was very instrumental in setting up the Japanese Peace Research Association. I met Hisako first in Japan briefly, and then I met her at an international conference in Kiel, England, which I worked on with a male colleague. And we managed to make it a peace education conference, much to the chagrin of my countrymen. Hisako brought to us Paulo Freire. The peace educators there had vaguely heard about him and read about the methodology and the situation, but we didn't put it all together properly. But Hisako did. And her argument was that this is a pedagogy of peace. And that has become, along with feminist pedagogy, a very important part of the field. I would also like to speak, when I speak of Hisako, of another dear friend, Elise Bolding. Elise, I believe, was something around 10 or so years older than I, and she had been actually the inspiration and first energy that produced the International Peace Research Association. Professionally, she was a sociologist. She got her degree in her 50s after she raised all of her multiple children. And she was very interested in how people and societies learn. And she also happened to be married to a world-renowned economist who has begun to have correspondence with scholars around the world around issues of peace, and she was the emptier of his wastebasket. So she started to notice all the stamps from other countries, and then she'd sort of look at that and say, oh my, look at that with that, and look at that with that. There's a movement here. There are people all over the world doing peace research. They have to be talking to each other more than just sort of one person to another this way. So out of that came the International Peace Research Association. She was always interested in learning, and what we learned as a human family from history, her great work about women's history, the underside of history, was a marvelous gift to that. And she also saw global trends. And another of her wonderful contributions was called, it was a small monograph, but it was called Building a Global Civic Culture. And she lifted up what citizens' movements around the world were doing to influence the way the world was evolving. And that was at once instructive and very hope-inducing. So, there has been much written about her, and she has written much, but she is very often rightly called the mother of peace research. And I would say that I am a member of WILTSNAP and have been since 1975. I joined just before the first women's conference in Mexico. But they have been in the forefront ever since. And the work that they, as a civil society organization, do is very much along the lines of what I'm now calling inclusive peace education. And that is women working together around defining the issues and putting the issues together in a more holistic way. I want also to mention another person who I think, I'm not dead sure of this, I think she was also a member of WILF. Her name was Eva Nordstrom. She was a Norwegian. She called herself a social educator. She saw her role as a teacher. She had been a teacher, a classroom teacher in a Norwegian village. When I met her, she was a distinguished professor of education at the University of Oslo, always very interested in peace. She saw social education as the essence of education, and that is teaching youngsters to be creative, contributing citizens of their societies and communities. And she did that with little children and taught teachers how to do that with little children. She was one of the first people who focused on the environment as a peace educator, as a peace education issue. And Eva also had the vision of collaboration between Soviet and US educators throughout the Cold War, which is something that I and my colleague Willard Jacobson at Teachers College also had, and we tried, and we weren't very successful. And then one day Eva came to visit us at the college, and she said, would you come to Oslo and meet some Soviet educators? We would like to get you together and have a workshop together and see what we could do as a group. So, of course, we said yes. We went to Oslo, big adventures about lots of things, how the difficulties of visas and so forth, but we all got there. And Willard and another person, American, and I were waiting for the Soviet delegation to arrive. And in walk 4 people, 2 men, 2 women, 1 woman I had met 6 months before at a meeting in Turin. And she and I, as members, representatives of the superpowers, were confronted daily by all the other members of the meeting. And we became jointly responsible for all the problems of the world. So we thought, okay, if that's the way it is, we're going to work together. And she and I there at that time decided we were going to work together. So that was Valentina Matina. And Valentina Matina, all the years that I was working in peace education in the United States, she was working in peace education in the Soviet Union. So when we came together, we always would kid about it, it's a historic moment and so forth. But we also became very good and close friends. And just, it was a great example of of the nonsense of political division that is imposed on us. Let me see if I'd like to also mention, there's so many I could mention. Alicia Cabazudo in Argentina, who was a school teacher who brought her students to the window of their schoolroom to watch the burning of the books when the military dictatorship began to take over the schools as well as everything else. And she told them what was happening and what their life responsibility would be from then on. And she has been very much involved in peace education, and particularly the human rights aspect of peace education. I'd like to also mention a person that I don't know directly, but she was educated by friends of mine, and she's no longer with us, but I found her one of the most she was a real visionary as well as an activist and a very brave woman. And her name was Juangari Matai. She received the Nobel Prize, and she made the environment a peace education issue, a peace issue, an issue that we're only coming now to see fully what it is. And also when I think of Wangari, I think of the Chipko women who were great peace educators. They didn't think of themselves as being educators when they were trying to protect their sacred and essential trees, but they taught us so much about the solidarity among them and this feeling of the solidarity with the earth. And any number of other Indian women. I could go on and on and on. I had thought about this before, but now as you ask the question, I'm starting to think about it a little differently. Let me just say where I would hope the field could be 5 years from now. Ordinarily, I used to think in 10 and 20-year terms because the proposals for disarmament were in 10-year cycles, and Elise Bolding used to talk about the 100-year present and how we could learn from that. But we are living through what Martin Luther King called the urgency of now. So 5 years from now, I would like to see that we have made significant strides in having reasoned, respectful conversations with people who see the world very differently than we do, but whom we assume don't want the world destroyed any more than we do, even if we see their behaviors leading toward that end. Somehow in the next 5 years, we who are concerned with learning have to help ourselves and as many as we can to learn to communicate with those who now, in what I am experiencing as an American in this election, we are each other's, if we hold the world, a different view of the world, that makes us enemies, fellow citizens. You know, we were told last night if the other side wins, the whole country will be totally destroyed. So somehow we have to get beyond that, because not only this country, the world will be destroyed by that kind of communicative pattern. So that is absolutely essential. Another thing I would like to see is that we fully understand, both cognitively and effectively, that we are one part of one living planet. We are not separate from that planet. We are not inhabitants of the planet. We are not just on the planet. We are of the planet. Our bodies come from the planet. Our bodies go back into the planet. We are part of the whole living cycle of Earth. And even though we have many different views of religious belief and spirituality and things of that kind, I will unashamedly say, we must resacralize the earth. The earth is sacred, and we must have that as an understanding that guides everything we do. So that as we would not harm our children, we do not behave so as to harm the earth. And if we begin to think that way, if we think in terms of what I call earth imperative, all the other issues would have to be resolved, because the continuation of poverty and oppression also helps to destroy the earth. The spread of pandemic diseases because of poverty and oppression among many, and too much interaction among others at another level, helps to destroy the earth. War and preparation for war helps to destroy the earth. And every time we injure in any way another human being, we injure part of earth. And that includes ourselves. So as we cherish those we see and love, we need to cherish all the network of relationships of love. And we care for ourselves because we're part of that. And we care for ourselves so that we can care for others, and that we can be and continue to be effective agents of care for the earth and for all we are connected with, which is everybody in a way. And I firmly believe if we could get that into our heads, and climate change is not just a problem. Climate change is one of those existential threats we're facing now. So 5 years from now, we will not have solved any of these problems. But I would like to see that peace education has taken on forms of thinking and learning that enable us to see the problems holistically, that will enable us to engage in conflict resolution as conflict transformation, the creative resolution of conflict, and that we see all these problems as common problems that we work on together in community. And that's one of the things that when you go back to what I was talking about of the essence of peace education is working collaboratively with those who think in many different ways, and the more ways, the better. And to do so, respecting them fully, appreciating those differences as being helpful to what we're trying to do, and to do so in a joyous way. Because one of the things that I most suffer about is so much joy has been ripped from us because of the way we are being pushed to think of our problems. So I also am calling for peace education to go back to some of its roots, to be an agent of liberation and liberation from divisive thinking that divides us from each other and from our planet.